So here's chapter 1 of this updated version of the Straightforward Riding book. Chapter 1 is about communication and harmony. There are so many articles and books written about riding and training techniques that it can quite boggle the brain. Who do you believe? Which trainer is best? What is the latest thinking on training techniques like deep and low and the use of draw reins? What is the difference between competition dressage and classical dressage? There are countless numbers of people to whom you can ask these questions, and all will have an opinion. But the person who rarely gets asked the questions and yet can provide the most honest and reliable answers is the horse. So do you just go up to the horse and say, "Hello horse, what is your opinion on draw reins?" and expect them to tell you? Well, there are animal communicators who are doing just that, but let's not get distracted. We can all make use of the feedback that the horse is always providing, but the missing link in this line of communication is often a willingness or ability in people to notice. Even when it is accepted that the horse is expressing an opinion, the evidence, which is in the way of the horse is behaving and responding, then relies on the interpretation by the people involved in that horse. A horse that's frightened, confused, uncomfortable, and either reluctant or reactive can often be described and treated as being badly behaved, resistant, difficult, or ungenerous. And it's this fundamental lack of awareness that leads to poor examples of horsemanship and some very miserable and suppressed horses. As I rewrite this book in 2024, it's heartening to see a massive rise of interest in the social license aspect of the way we humans manage, train and ride horses, in particular the way horses are treated when using competition. This interest can potentially protect horses from many levels of harm and abuse, which is important, but it needs to be remembered that in this time of social media, it isn't only people with a genuine knowledge about and respect for horses who will determine what's considered to be acceptable. If enough people decide that using horses in competition is cruel, they could kill off many equestrian sports. With this in mind, anyone and everyone who has an influence on the lives of ridden horses would be wise to make sure that we can stand by our actions as having the safety and welfare of the horse as our priority. Riding and training trends. As in many things in life, fashion trends and attitudes seem to go in cycles, and some years ago there was a definite increase in horse owners looking for alternative ways of training horses, which coincided with the rise and popularity of what became labelled as natural horsemanship. It should never have been given that name or title, because there can never be anything natural about the control of a horse by a human, and persuading it to carry a rider is about as unnatural as you can get, even when done with respect and kindness. This was created by trainers who are predominantly from a Western riding background, who claim to have studied and adopted ways of influencing and training horses that mimic the way wild horse herds communicate and control each other's behaviour. There's no doubt that compared to some of the hideous ways of breaking horses for riding that had been common in certain areas of the USA, these natural horsemanship trainers were promoting a less aggressive approach, and that had to be a good thing. They usually created systematic and formulaic programs of training, and there's no doubt that creating a step-by-step program was helpful to a lot of horses simply because it made the riders and handlers more consistent and aware in their own behaviour. Training horses can take far longer than needed and be stressful for everyone when humans can't be consistent. Coming mainly from the USA, these trainers tended to be very good at marketing and creating goal-oriented communities who were willing to pay a lot of money to belong. Nothing wrong with that, and I know that a lot of horse owners who were searching for direction and wanting to be part of a community of like-minded people got a lot out of it. There is no doubt of the potential benefit of training humans to be more aware of the way horses perceive them and react to our own body language. There is also no doubt that there are methods of working a horse from the ground, when appropriate and relevant, that can help a horse to understand what we're asking from them before we get on their backs, and can also help them to be more adaptable and confident. What Carol and I saw was that the problem seemed to start when these natural horsemanship trainers moved on from training horses from the ground to getting on their backs and then teaching others how to ride like they rode as part of their programs. As mentioned before, this seemed to stem from the fact that most of the natural horsemanship trainers came from a Western riding background, which had practically no interest in or emphasis on understanding and protecting the comfort and the biomechanics of the horse. I'm not going to get into the reasons for this and the implications here, but we'll just say that to understand how to ride a horse in a way that first and foremost does it no harm requires an education in the biomechanics of good, safe, movement and balance. If you're interested, I wrote a piece explaining this some years ago, and in a downloadable PDF version that is currently available on the Balance website, and here is the link to that file. There's also a video with the text read out loud on the Balance YouTube channel, and it's called The Care and Training of the Supernatural Horse. The very fact that these days more people accept that horses are sentient beings who need us to pay attention to the non-verbal language they use so that we can understand them is progress. It's very encouraging to see more people turning their backs on the joyless domination of the horse that has been all too common, particularly in the training of competition horses. Having said that, there are still too many people who are willing to pay large amounts of money to a bored-looking instructor, often slouched in a chair at the side of the arena and looking at their phone, to shout abuse at them, while making their poor horse grind around a 20-metre circle for an hour at a time. And the instructors can often charge even more if they shout out their criticism and orders with a foreign accent. It's also still too common for horse owners to have lesson only for the instructor to say, "Just let me get on for 10 minutes, and then proceed to bully and abuse the horse for an hour before handing the dripping and defeated animal back to the owner to cool off. Unfortunately, many owners are too intimidated by the instructor to object to the way they are riding, and so the horse has no one to protect it. Of course, there are times when it can help the horse to have the instructor get on and help clarify something, and for the rider to observe from the ground, but it needs to be done with a specific intention and not as a way of a bored instructor to show off. Doesn't this come back to the fact that when we stop communicating with the horse and are not prepared to acknowledge the information that they are giving us, we tend to lose our way? We fail to notice that what we are asking from the horse may not be appropriate or fair to expect from that individual. It is the nature of horses to try to figure out what they need to do to be as comfortable as possible, or better said, they try to figure out what gives them the most relief from discomfort, and humans have been taking advantage of this behaviour for centuries. This presents riders, handlers and trainers with the moral and ethical dilemma of being very clear about what they ask horses to do, why they're asking, and how they persuade the horse to comply. To be a good partner to a horse and other people requires less telling and a lot more listening and general observation. We need to rediscover the kind of innocence that questions the information we're given by others. For example, we frequently hear that good dressage should present a harmonious and beautiful picture. And this is true, but how many have looked, and I mean really looked, at horses at dressage competitions? The sad fact is that it's all too common to see horses who look tense and tight in their movement, disengaged with their hindquarters, with poor basic paces and a lack of coordination and balance, and the list could go on. In higher levels of dressage competition, one would expect to see excellent examples of sound horses moving with power and elasticity, because a judging at the lower levels would have weeded out poor training and riding technique. Certainly, if all judges from the lowest levels to the highest levels were to stick to the FEI definitions of correctness, and if they were all to mark accordingly and consistently, they would reward the best trainers and riders and penalise those who do the horse potential harm through bad, rough or constrictive riding. They should be blind to the popularity or fame of the rider in front of them, because their role and responsibility is to keep competition dressage honest and the best example of mutually beneficial horse and human partnership. When Carol and I wrote the first version of this straightforward riding book back in 1998, The most common problems one would see in competition dressage were horses being ridden with their heads behind the vertical and with their hindquarters disengaged. This created poor and incorrect balance and movement. Typically, one would see collected paces that were disengaged and lacking in any power. When you watch a horse in piaffe, which is the highest level of collection asked for in competition dressage, you know there's a problem when the hind feet are coming higher off the floor than the front feet. The piaffe is supposed to be the highest expression of forwardness in collection in competition dressage, but what is often seen at lower levels and used to be very common at the higher levels is a kind of soft shoe shuffle, with the front feet barely coming off the ground because the weight of the horse was too far forward, often with the rider bouncing up and down with enthusiasm to make up for the lack of action from the horse. Why? Because the trot has usually been shortened by the rider from the front and causing the horse's back to contract and drop. This rotates the pelvis in the wrong direction and effectively inhibits the full use of the hip joints and hocks. With the hindquarters disabled, the horse's weight stays too far forward. This isn't collected trot, it's a disconnected trot. It may be counterintuitive, but for a horse to be in a collected organisation, the spine has to be able to lengthen. In many riders' minds, there is only the image of a horse shortening its whole frame as soon as the word collection is mentioned. In reality, correct collection creates a shortening of the horse's base, i.e. the length of the stride and the degree to which the hind feet can step closer to the point of balance. The image of a hedgehog or an armadillo can sometimes be a useful reminder that the shortening of one side of the body is, by necessity, enabled through the lengthening of the opposite side. Too strong an emphasis on the shortening aspect of collection can create influences that cause contraction in the neck and back, that disable the hindquarters and destroy the quality of the movement to the point where it becomes inefficient, incorrect, and ugly. In 2024, the way horses are being selectively bred, trained and ridden in higher levels of competition dressage seems to have created a very distorted and peculiar way of moving that tends to emphasize the exaggerated contraction of the limbs as they come off the ground, rather than a focus on the weight of the horse being carried more by the hindquarters in a strong, efficient and easy way. The way the horses have to move now in order to get the highest marks makes them look, to me, like they're performing some kind of circus tricks. It could be said to be clever to be able to get a horse to be able to move like this, and it's probably seen as more impressive than a horse who's just very well balanced, well organised, and only needing to put the least amount of effort into producing movements that is desirable and correct in accordance with the FEI definitions. Maybe it's just me being too old and set in my ways. But are these horses showing good balance and engagement with their weight taken more on the hindquarters than their forequarters? Or has this exaggerated and different way of moving become a new kind of competition dressage that the FEI needs to acknowledge and clarify whether it's what they are now defining as correct and desirable? When we wrote this little book, we wanted to question and challenge some of the ways that horses were being trained and ridden back in the 1980s and 90s. We wanted to make it simple for any rider to understand basic natural biomechanics and movement. So we'll cover some of the basic and important building blocks of good riding in the following chapters. We'll keep it simple because simple and consistent is what horses find most helpful. But don't make the mistake of thinking that simple means it's always easy. In fact, one of the hardest aspects of using a stripped-back, simple approach is that humans can find it difficult to believe that anything simple has value, and difficult to stay consistent in the way that they ride. It's humans who invented this thing that we call riding, not horses. A fairly obvious thing to say, you might think, but worth keeping in mind. And before we move on to the chapters that look at these foundations of good training and riding, I just wanted to mention something else that I think is worth keeping in mind. Horses are perfectly designed to function efficiently and safely when left in their natural environments, but when we impose the unnatural weight of a rider on his back, it overloads the forequarters and disrupts and disables his natural balance and movement. This creates an immediate loss of balance, which often leads to bracing and stiffness, a lot more stress on most of his joints, which often leads to damage over time, and a sense of vulnerability, which can make the horse reactive and tense. So, as I explain in my Supernatural Horse article, If we care about the welfare of the ridden horse, we have to, as a minimum aim, learn how to address the way our weight corrupts his balance and changes his natural way of moving. Once a young horse has been disabled by the new and unnatural influence of a rider, he doesn't know how to recover his balance. He just has to learn how to adapt and compensate. It's the rider who has to help the horse learn what he has to do to carry a rider in a way he never has to do when not being ridden. So just sitting on a horse and going along on a loose rein, or no rein contact at all, might create the illusion of giving the horse freedom, but it's not a kind way to ride. It just abandons the horse to the consequences of having to move in an unnatural way.